Welcome to Books and Beyond with Bound. I'm Tara Khandelwal,
I'm Michelle DeCosta.
and in this podcast, we uncover the stories behind some of the best written books of our time.
And find out how these books reflect our lives and our society today.
So tune in every Wednesday to enter a whole new world with a new author and a new idea.
Yes, and after 3 years and 2 million listens, we are back with a power packed season 5.
With hard hitting questions and life changing books.
So let's dive in.
So, before we begin, Michelle, I want to ask you, what is the craziest thing you've ever done for a story?
So I think it was very long back. Okay, I think it was around 2012 or 2011. I was attempting to write a psychological thriller, and one of the main themes of the book had to do with a fish and a fish aquarium. At home, and I was really curious because I couldn't find much on the internet, and I thought, okay, why not go to an actual aquarium shop? So what I did was I told my dad, you come with me, okay, and you just keep the salesman distracted, right? Because I usually don't like it, when salesmen or women just hover around you. I feel this pressure, like, oh God, I should buy something, So I told him, just speak to him, just and he's very good at conversation. So he was just speaking to him, and what I did was I closely observed each aquarium piece in the shop, taking notes of the kind of fish, the colors, the size of the pebbles, whatever. But I think that was one of the most fun things I've ever done for research. And I felt very guilty, because it was kind of like window shopping. I wasn't really buying it. And one thing that I learned from this research was, there are certain cleaner fish, Tara. I don't know if you know of it. So they kind of stick to the surface of the tank, and their duty is just to clean. So they eat up the algae, they eat up all the waste or whatever. I found that so fascinating. Like, even fish have their own roles, like
Yeah.
humans.
So how did
Yeah.
the fish come into the book? What was the significance of fish in the
Oh
book?
my gosh. Okay, I've abandoned that manuscript, but I would say in that I think one of my characters found solace in the fish aquarium. So it's kind of like, she was a very introverted character, a character who doesn't really gel with people. So the point I was trying to make in that story was that, she can associate with fish in a better way. Like, for example, the cleaner fish who's given a very stereotypical role of cleaning the tank. It's she feels boxed up like that in life. So it was kind of like a conversation she has with each type of fish, and like a friendship that she builds up with them. I was kind of trying to show that how she could relate more to fish than people.
Very interesting. But the reason that I ask is, what's the first thing that people think of when they think of writers, right? They think of writers sitting in their rooms, introverted, having a cup of chai. And I have to admit, I am sort of one of those quintessential people who love sort of like having, their cup of tea and sort of reading a book and curling up in your book. But as a journalist, as an editor, all of these things, and in our interviews and experiences with writers over the last 4 seasons and now season 5, we found out that writers are so much more than the typical stereotype, right? Because in order to write, one has to live. And what we found is that, writers live on the extremes, and some of the research and some of the things that writers do in the name of research is not just sitting in the library, but is going undercover, is putting themselves in places of extreme danger sometimes, following people who are completely different demographic than them. I think what we want to do on this episode today is bust some of those myths. So what do you think, Michelle?
Yeah, yeah, no, you're right, Tara, because I think one of the most common misconceptions I've heard, or at least, even I thought of as I grew up, is that writers are recluses. They are reclusive, they write, they lock themselves up in a room, for inspiration, for creativity. I have even heard that some writers don't like windows in a room because windows can be distraction, right? It can lead to a lot of procrastination. Which is, yes, I agree. On some days, I would rather look out of the window than write because it's easier to do that. But even in popular culture, there's a misconception that writers are recluses, right? So there are some really famous ones like Octavia Butler, and she's called herself a hermit. She's given herself that label. Then there's obviously Harper Lee, right, who completely disappeared off the earth after the success of To Kill a Mockingbird. And I also read somewhere that Emily Dickinson did not step outside her house for almost 2 decades, Tara. Can you believe it?
Wow, wow. Yeah. And also, sort of, we see that, not only these real life examples, but also in pop culture, right? We see sort of writers hold up in their rooms, and there's nothing wrong with that. We do it too. But what we don't see more often about writers who have done some truly crazy things, they are their own rock artists, I feel. And
Yeah.
one of the pop culture sort of images that comes to my mind is Jack Kerouac, the American writer. So he wrote this book called On the Road.
Yeah, actually, Kerouac is a really interesting example because his book influenced. I would say it's kind of like a cult following where other writers realize that if you're a little hatke, right? If you're a little bindas type, you go out, make friends, travel, you'll have a lot more material to write about, right? Because the most of the movies that I've seen based on writers, right? They usually have reclusive lives. They are very comfortable in their own zone and they write really well. They are brilliant, but they don't really travel much.
Most of pop culture and a lot of movies about writers have perpetuate this particular stereotype, right? But here we're trying to sort of bust that myth in this episode because we've seen writers do things for their stories that have shocked us to their core.
Yeah.
And we always leave asking how the hell did they do this. In this episode we're really going to bust the myth that research equals boring,
Yeah.
because when I tell someone, oh, I have to do a lot of research for this, the
Hmm.
immediate thing that comes to your mind is something very different than what actually is happening.
Yeah.
Because what we're seeing is that research is one of the most exciting things a writer can do. Some truly amazing, interesting anecdotes have come out in these episodes because these writers have gone into some really extreme situations. So that's really what we're trying to do in this episode. And by the end of the episode, we hope that you find ways to get up from your seat and look for stories wherever you can as well.
Yeah, I think the stereotype is something that we see often, Tara, but I feel that, living is something all of us do, right? That's a given. And that itself gives you stories. Just to share my own experience, to a very simple trip to DMart, right? So what I did once was, just to mix up my routine a little bit. So what we usually do when we go shopping is we have a list, right? We have a shopping list, you have a grocery list. You set out with the mindset to buy certain things. But what I did that day was I told my parents, okay, you go ahead, you do your shopping. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at those things we have never usually bought. We have not gone for ideally. And I noted down the things. I'm just giving you an example out of the top of my head. Let's say I would ordinarily not go for orange cream biscuits. Okay, this is just a wild example. But what I did was I noted them. And then what I thought to myself, okay, who would pick that? And I would say that made me go into so many different directions for stories which I would have never come across had I just stuck to my grocery list ever. So I feel that, going out there, living your life is something everybody does. And that's something I want to see more in pop culture.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like I was reading this story about the award-winning screenwriter behind
Hmm.
West Wing and the Social Network. And he actually, Aaron Sorkin, and he had confessed that he broke his nose while writing.
Oh my gosh. How?
Yeah. So, but basically, he likes to act out his stories in front of the mirror. And one
Oh.
time, after getting carried away, he accidentally butted his head. So, yeah, I mean,
Oh God.
yeah, acting out your dialogues is good, but
Yeah, no,
yeah.
I was no, I was just going to say that, Taraya, because sometimes some characters really require to you to become like them, right? So this reminds me a lot of method actors. Some roles really require you to do so much research that you become like them. I think I had read that Varun Dhawan, for his movie Badlapur, he locked himself up in a room and to really get into the mindset to go to these extreme levels, like the actor in The Machinist who really starved himself. My God, very very scary, but he did that, just for that role. So I think today we are also going to cover writers who have done crazy stuff as research for their books.
Yeah, so one definitely, we mentioned a few, Aaron Sorkin and Jack Kerouac, but one of the things that, one of the stories that stuck with me throughout the seasons is
Mm.
Rajat Obhekar's journey for his book Truck Day India.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
we mentioned that, in a few other episodes as well, but it's so fascinating because he traveled all over India, literally from Kashmir to Kanyakumari for 6 months in the backs of trucks. This is like without a break, day in and day out. He was sitting in the backs of these trucks, all because he wanted to chronicle the lives of truck drivers, which is sort of a demographic that hasn't been studied before. And he's obviously
Yeah.
from a very different sort of socioeconomic background than the people that he was studying, but he managed to sort of assimilate himself within this demographic, and also sort of within the hardships, right? Because he's obviously from an urban setting, and he's sort of living in the backs of his trucks, sort of on the road throughout, in the heat, in the cold, whatever it is. And the stories that he had was so fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. And out of all the stories that he shared with us on the episode, Tara, one really stayed with me, because he had a lot of, I would say, fun company, right? So many were there. But out of all, I think the most interesting duo was Sham, who was the driver, and his handyman, Rajinder, right? And so Sham is this, driver of the night. And what Rajat calls him is the creature of the night, right? So because he prefers driving in the dark. Can you imagine? That itself is, for me, that itself sounds so scary. But then, Rajat asked him, Rajinder Bhai, have you ever encountered highway robbers? And apparently, he has encountered so many. So, what these robbers do is, they plant nails on the road, right? So, obviously, to puncture the tires. And he says that that is common. But you know what others do, Tara? My God, this really gave me goosebumps. Some of them actually pose as ambulance drivers, right? And they just wait there at the truck, and then they force it to stop. And then what they do, they rob them completely. And apparently, what used to happen 15 years ago is kind of like a dystopian movie. What used to happen is they would not just take their money or whatever they had on them, they would take them, kidnap them, probably steal their kidneys, and then let them go. Imagine. My goodness. And I don't think Rajat would have ever gotten that story had he not hitchhiked, taken that ride, and gone with them.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's crazy. And I also like the part where, this Rajinder Bhai was caught unaware in the jungle, in the Hasimara jungle in Bengal. And he would literally fight off these bandits with his bare hands. And these
Yeah.
bandits, yeah, these bandits would sort of hide in the canopy of the jungle. And then they would
Hmm.
they would jump onto these trucks, and then they would cut off the ropes and take all the goods. So this
Yeah.
Rajat Bhai had a lot of different stories. And another
Yeah.
thing that was so interesting, that Rajat sort of he spent days on the road, and he just sort of he didn't even have a recorder because the truck's engine and the music was so loud,
Yeah, exactly.
and he was just sort of listening and taking notes and sleeping in the back of these trucks. And he
Hmm.
became, and we asked him about his friendship with this truck driver. He became really
Hmm.
good friends with Jora Bhai, and he said
Yeah.
that he never have the chance to be such good friends with him before. And we asked him, you guys are from such different backgrounds, and then how did you connect, you know and then he said that obviously, we are connecting because we're spending so much time
Hmm.
together.
Yeah, and over
Yeah,
cigarettes, Tara.
over cigarettes, yeah, and
Yeah, yeah.
cigarettes and alcohol, and the kind of
Yes.
insights that you get from that friendship is something amazing. But
Hmm.
I'm just thinking, and that's something that we've spoken also a lot about, is this was such a fantastic sort of journey to
Yeah.
get to the heart of this demographic and putting yourself out there. I'm just thinking, as a woman, I'd never be able to do this, right? Like,
Hmm. But you know what I think, Tara? The moment I read his book and the moment after we spoke to him, right? I was thinking, why not interview women truck drivers? I know they are rare. I know, and India, I have not really seen. But then I've heard, for example, there are women truck drivers in Canada. Like, they can maneuver trucks amidst ice or snow that is like inches thick, which is to me sounds like a Bollywood movie stunt. But that's something that they do every day, which is a part of their livelihood. So if I ever get a chance now, I think I'll interview them. What about you? What do you
hmm,
think?
who will I interview? Well,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, like, after sort of, working as a journalist, we interview so many people. And I always start wondering, that simple people. So I went to sort of my beauty parlor, and I was speaking to the person who's cutting my hair, and he's from the Northeast, Mizoram. And he was telling me that apparently lots and lots of people from Mizoram come into the cities. I'm not sure if this is correct or wrong. This is what he's told me. Lots of people come from Mizoram into the cities to work, in these parlors and things like that. So I was like, oh, that might be an interesting demographic to interview. And that got me thinking that, when I was younger, I remember I used to go with my mom to a lot of these Chinese beauty parlors
Right.
run by these
Okay.
Chinese people
Mhm.
who would obviously come in from Calcutta and then, settle down in the 90s. It was a big thing. I was like,
Oh.
that's a full new sort of story. And I thought of those also because they're places that, like, as a woman, I can go to
Ha, easily access them.
easily
Correct.
accessible. But I
Yeah,
think,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
in our interviews, this accessibility and safety that hasn't stopped a lot of the writers.
Yeah, yeah. And so before we discuss that, Tara, I want to mention because you mentioned parlor. The ones I used to go to na, they were Banjarans, right? So we often hear the word Banjara. In of course there's this famous Bollywood song also, but I never knew, they're kind of like their history or all this. So listening to them, so Banjarans apparently are migrants throughout, like nomads. I mean, so there's not like a fixed place where they said they keep moving around. So I think that's another demographic that I would really like to cover someday.
Yeah, no, very interesting. But yeah, I think speaking of like women who like are going to unconventional locations and research that is extreme, right?
Hmm.
One of the writers that I think has always stuck with me is Tara Kaushal, who we interviewed in season 2 for her book Why Men Rape.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was so interesting because it was so daring, because she interviews these 9 men all of from all over India who have committed acts of sexual violence. And in order to sort of interview them, she actually went undercover because she couldn't really tell them why she was interviewing them because they would sort of censor their answers. So she actually went undercover as sort of like a movie researcher. And in the interview, she talks about how, she had to act a little bit, while she was conducting these interviews with these men, and there was a distinction between
Yeah.
her as like this horrified person versus her as this researcher. And then like she would send her husband her WhatsApp live location, and her husband would be on tenterhooks looking at this live location, right? And then she had to go, and
Yeah.
it's not only like the urban setting, she was in like rural areas and
Hmm.
all of India. She had a chaperone, but it's still dangerous. She's putting herself very, very squarely. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it is. And since you mentioned live location, Tara, I was just thinking. So the other day, I went to this graphic novel library here, okay, in Bombay. And of course, there's a lot of traveling, right? Bombay is huge. So to go there itself, it takes like hours. And my dad was like, you share the live location, okay, be careful. And I was thinking to myself, oh my gosh, these writers have gone where all, right? Like, I mean, imagine sharing a live location from a rural area and that too, like interviewing these men. And another thing, that for me, what really stood out, Natara, see, if you're just living with them, in a disguise, I think you're probably not brushing against danger. But what she did was she asked them 250 questions. And just imagine if a question rubs somebody the wrong way. Oh my gosh, like I can't even imagine the reaction. And one of the questions that really stood out to me was, has your wife ever said no? And have you done it anyway? Like, because she couldn't really like directly ask them, like, have you raped your wife or do you even consider that as rape? Because she was trying to get around it through an indirect way, right? And the answer was almost always yes, right? My wife just always says no. So yeah, so I did it. And that for something was so traumatic to hear. Just imagine hearing that as a woman, and she did that and she interviewed all these 9 men. So I feel for me that was one of the the questions that really I would say triggered me, and I could only imagine what Tara Kaushal went to. And it was not just during the research, right? It's like she also shared with us that after the research, years later, like now, like she has nightmares, and one day she woke up like biting her husband in her sleep because she was that disturbed.
Yeah, I mean, these things, it's not fun. Like we've seen with Rajat and with Tara Kaushal as well,
Hmm.
right? They're putting themselves literally out there physically. Tara Kaushal as a woman, mentally as well.
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, there's a bigger purpose for their book, which is, she really wanted to uncover the reasons why, this is happening. In order to do that, she went to sort of, she was on Facebook, she went to the police, went through detective agencies. So I just, her journey was, I think, really really fascinating, and kudos to her. And we've also spoken to, so many other women authors who have traveled to unknown places and taken huge risks. And another name that comes to mind is Sonia Falero.
Oh, yes. And I think, for me, Sonia Falero's book, right, The Good Girls, really, really stood out to me, Tara, because I remember browsing through my phone, okay, back in 2014, and coming across this image of two girls hanging from a tree. And, it was so disturbing, and it set this wildfire of curiosity throughout, Twitter. I mean, it went viral, whatever. And then, we obviously, the news moves on. The next day you see another news, then you see another news, right? And then we forgot about it. And then this book comes out, right? And what Sonia actually did was she went to UP, right, to uncover the real story of these two teenage girls who died in Badao in UP, right? Like, what really happened? Was it a suicide? Was it a murder? And she researched over 5 years. She went back and forth from London, I would say, in a very patriarchal environment where people, and she shared with us that some of them were resisting replying to her because the case was done and dusted. A year had passed, and they were like, okay, but now why is she coming and asking us these questions? And so imagine facing all that, resistance from them. And one incident really stood out to me, Tara. So there was one of the policemen whom she had contacted, right, and that man threatened her on the call. He said that, I will attack you if you track me down. I'm definitely going to attack you, and I know where you're living. So I think that is something that she had to live, that fear is something she had to live with day in and day out while she was researching.
Yeah, that's a crazy story for sure. Would you ever sort of like, like go undercover, Michelle? Like, would you sort of change your identity, for a story, or have you done that?
It's very interesting, actually, Tara, because I have considered this a number of times. I'll tell you why. Because I've, like, when you dress up for different occasions, right? So, for example, let's say one day I wear Western, and the next day I wear a sari, or, whatever, like a desi attire. People have told me sometimes that they can't recognize me in these different attires. And I often thought to myself, oh, wow, that means I can disguise myself probably and, go in locations and people wouldn't even know it's me. I have thought of that. What about you?
No, not undercover, but have you ever felt sort of like, because as writers we mentioned that, like, we go out there sometimes for like stories, right? And we've seen that
Hmm,
happen.
hmm, hmm.
We've been talking about these examples, but so have you
Yeah.
ever like felt like danger as a woman, like maybe like you're out and because I know that you told me this, that weekends are your time where you're sort of like out and about because you're gathering sort of,
Yes.
sights and sounds and smells and like material, right, that you can maybe incorporate into a story. So
Hmm,
have you
hmm.
ever felt sort of like danger as a woman while sort of going for a story?
Yeah, Tara, I think you've noticed it, right. I do love to go out on weekends because I think, when the rest of the week you're holed up at home, it's better to, just take the time out and go. And what happens to me is, sometimes some things trigger stories within you, right? Some things I might observe. Let's say an incident has happened. Let's say a person has said something, or I've noticed something, and it could be anything, right? So one thing that happened to me that really triggered this need to, pursue that story or follow the story was when I visited my cousin's house. Kids, so they stay in Vikhroli, and there was an unfortunate incident that happened to them. So their neighbor, what that person did was he just stood on the railway track, like everyone thought, okay, he's just standing, he's waiting for a train, okay, very regular thing, and then he just jumps in front of it. A very, very scary incident. And what happened after that really shook me, as a writer. And it's something that I actively pursue. It's really difficult, obviously, to find a dead body once they, commit suicide when they jump in front of the train. So there is always a person they assign to do that. There is one person who collects these body parts. And for me, I was like, oh my gosh, like I have to speak to this person. I have to interview them to find out how could they do, such a thing, right? Just imagine, like, it's so traumatic. And what I did was I actually tried to contact that person on a next visit, obviously, because I had to mull it over. I had to think about. I couldn't get it out of my mind. Like, I was obsessed. I said, okay, this must be a really terrible job. to do. And later on, actually, I tried to contact him, through others. I tried to find out. I wanted to speak to him, but unfortunately, I couldn't. But maybe on another visit, I'll be successful. And I think the whole point of getting a story is to be persistent. Don't give up.
Hmm.
Don't give up if they rebuff you once, twice, whatever. But I also think this is a sensitive topic, so maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's very disturbing. I definitely think. Speaking of like your own life inspiring you, right? One of the books that I really liked and writing is about having these interesting experiences is Nitin Sekar's What's Left of the Jungle.
Yeah.
Yeah, that book is really interesting because it talks about the connection between people, wildlife, and nature. And it's about Nitin Sekar, who's this Indian American PhD student, and he comes to the Baksa Tiger Reserve to do field work. And while he's doing his field work, he sort of befriends Akshu, who's his field assistant and who's a local. So the book was really interesting because it went through two drafts, and the first draft was mostly about his research, and then he actually went and scrapped the entire thing and said that, what, I'm gonna make it about this guy Akshu and our friendship, because Akshu is so very interesting, right? So he's a villager, and like one of the incidents that's so interesting. So they live in the sort of like the border of this reserve. So they're obviously like farmers and things like that, and elephants come into their fields, and a lot of the villagers, they are involved in illegally collecting timber and firewood, and Akshu's always torn between protecting the forest and also using the forest to further his income. And there's one like really terrifying scene where there are these bunch of poachers and there's this like showdown with them. And Nitin Sekar, as an American Indian, such a different context. He went there and he found such an unlikely inspiration, which is this guy who he became best friends with, and he's written a full book. And I actually asked him, did Akshu read the book? And actually, Akshu and him had done a lot of Zoom calls as well when the book was going on.
Oh.
So yeah, writing's about all these interesting experiences, right?
Yeah. I think Tara, see, like friendships or bonds or relationships that you build with these last a lifetime, right? And I have a very different writer to mention here, because I think, yes, friendship, you can make with nature, with people, with animals, with plants, all of that. But there are some writers who also make friends with ghosts, so they put themselves in such situations where they come into very close contact with spirits, with ghosts, right? So it's, I'm talking about the horror writer Neil De Silva, whom we've interviewed this season, and he's also, mentored at Bounds virtual writing retreat. So for his book Haunted, Tara, he actually co-wrote it with this paranormal investigator, Jay Alani, okay? And the book actually covers 10 of the most haunting sites in India, right? Just to get these paranormal experiences. But what I find interesting is, Tara, there is a story in the book, okay, that's called The Lost Child of Kuldhara. Now that he didn't set out just to get a story, okay, he was visiting the village. He happened to be there, and apparently this village is there from the 13th century. Okay, so somewhere around like 200 years ago, people just vanished without a trace. Like nobody knows where they went, what happened. One day on a very cold and dark night, Jay finds himself there, right? And then what happens is something that has like shaken him for life. And I think our readers should read the book to know more about the lost child and what happens in Koldara. But apart from that, I feel, authors like Neil De Silva, they put themselves in situations which shake their reality, right? So what we asked him on our episode was, what does he do as part of research, right? He says that every time he writes a new book, he picks a new location, to basically to let the creativity flow. And one time when he was in this hotel room, right, all alone, he saw that the lights were flickering, right? And obviously he has a very high tolerance for all these, I would say, erratic stuff that might happen. But then it didn't stop. It just became worse and worse. Like it was flickering at a crazy level. That's when he ran out of the room, and he actually asked, the bellboy, and he said, okay, is this normal? Does this happen? Is this, is like, is the lighting faulty? Is it the electricity? And he said, no, it never happened. So just imagine, like, I think he would have like encountered so many things like that. What about you, Tara? Have you ever encountered something paranormal or out of this world?
No, no, but I found it really I loved like that his research involves booking himself into these isolated towns, sitting in these isolated rooms, and like he wants these paranormal experiences to happen because it gives him the vibe for fiction, which I find like
Yeah,
super
yeah.
fast. Like what an interesting research process, right?
Yeah, yeah, totally. I think it's something that's really, I would say, pushes the boundaries. Right? Since we're talking about extremes today, this is a totally different extreme.
Yeah, and like Manu Pillai, like one of India's like most prominent historians, says that research happens in cycles, and he does a lot of his research in libraries and things like that. But research also, like we've seen how like research happens while you're living, and research is everything. But research also happens over years and years. And yeah, it reminds me of Mansi Choksi, who we interviewed for her book, The Newlyweds. The episode is coming up this season, and there's a lot of like fun anecdotes. But what she does is she covers, she follows these three couples over 6 years. And one of the couples that really stood out to me was the Hindu Muslim couple, where sort of she decided to sort of follow them around for this extended period of time. And we see her getting really close to her subjects and almost being like a fly on the wall. I think in the interview she mentioned that she's been witness, and again she's from a very different socioeconomic background, and she's been witness to sort of like big blowout fights, between these couples, the
Yeah.
interactions with their parents, and all kinds of like things which she's put in the book. So it just makes you wonder, spending so much time also like doing this research is so very interesting.
Yeah, and actually for me, the couple Davinder and Neetu stood out, Tara, because they're like neighbors, right? Like, so they're from the same place, and one day they decide to elope, right? And then what do? So while Davinder takes the car out, and he has these friends with him for moral support, what Neetu does is she actually gives her parents sleeping pills, and like it was literally like I was holding my breath when I was reading that scene, Tara, because she found that her parents were awake. They were not sleeping. And she's so frustrated with Davinder. She's like, what pills did you give me? My parents are still awake. And then obviously, we know how things turn out. And then they manage to elope. And I would say there's so much in the book that really, really makes you, question what happens in our society, right? And one of the most disturbing things I came across were the love commandos, Tara. So initially they seem to be this really really helpful group of people who help these couples who are in need. They help them elope, right? Because of various reasons. There could be intercaste, interfaith, right? So I think then later on, what we discover as a reader is that the love commandos are extremely exploitative, very dangerous, and I feel that Mansi was able to excavate these things just because she did it over years, right? Imagine, like, because I don't think this is something you can get, with one visit.
Yeah, I mean, like it's again like research is sort of not like
Mm.
sitting in your at home, but
Yes.
doing all these things. But we haven't covered travel. I mean, like that's the ultimate
Mm.
sort of uh, way of putting yourself out in your comfort zone. And there's so many sort of authors also you've interviewed who have used travel as a way of research, right?
Yeah, and Tara, thinking about like conducting research over years, when I watched the movie Hustle recently, when I saw that there are these talent scouts who look for good basketball players from the NBA, I thought, okay, that's somebody I'd like to shadow, because as editors, it's a pretty much a desk job, right? We scout for talent on our laptop, on our devices, and we find stories. But I would love to go out there, travel, understand different cultures, see talent in different cultures right there on the ground. So I think that's something I would do if I get a chance to follow. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think travel, right? Like that's one of the like
Yes.
main like that's one such an interesting way in which a lot of these writers that we've spoken to find material and go out of their way and use it as sort of, they open up boundaries and all of those things. We've interviewed
Yeah, yeah.
travel writers. One writer that comes to mind is obviously Taran Khan, who
Yes.
who wrote this beautiful book about, her time in Kabul, and she spent so much time just walking the city and seeing it change. And And another one is Achal Malhotra, whose book Remnants of a Separation. It covers the stories of partition through objects people took with them or left behind. And for her research, she also wanted to visit Pakistan because a lot of she wanted to retrieve those stories as well. And I really like one particular story of her travels, where she developed this close bond with a driver who was driving her around. And he actually used to be the driver of somebody her parents knew really well.
Yeah, Kesarji, and the way he was there for her, Tara. So there was an incident that she shared. That so she had covered a lot of Muslim families and their stories, what they had taken with them during the partition. But she also wanted to cover profile of a Hindu person who stayed back. Right. So then she actually contacted this person, and he said, "Okay, meet me in a temple." Right. So there are apparently two very huge temples in Pakistan, and this was one of them. He said, "Meet me there." And then she said, "No, why don't we meet at your house? I would rather meet you there than at the temple." He said, "No, no, you're a Hindu, I'm a Hindu. Let's just meet at the temple." Okay, so she goes there, and Kesarji is driving her to this place. He obviously parks the car, and she goes to the temple, to hear him out. And she expected a story to let's say she wanted to know a different story, and what she got from the man was not something she expected. He said, "Oh yes, we are fine, everything is fine, life is amazing," all of that. And when she walked back to her car, she looked really dejected. She felt cheated, she said, because she expected something else and she got something else. And the driver was equally disturbed looking at her. He said, "What happened, beta? Like, the interview was not okay. What went wrong? Why are you so upset?" And then she was just controlling her tears. She wanted to break down. She just said, "Okay, I'll just give up if I'm not getting these stories." But then what he told her, Tara, I'll never forget that. He said, "Beta, all five fingers are not of the same length." And she thought, "What is he saying? What does he mean by this?" And then he said, "It means all your interviews might not go the same way. It's okay. Keep trying." And then she said, "Yeah," because she looked at her own hand, and that really like struck her. Yes, you might not. I mean, in research, you meet 1,000 people, right? You might not use all of their stories. You might not always get the stories you want, but I think the key is to keep trying. And for me, listening, to that bond that she shared with Kesarji is something very unique.
Yeah, like always keep hustling, right? It reminds
Yes.
me, like in traveling, we're speaking about traveling, we when I had gone to Switzerland,
Huh.
my mom had broken her ankle, so we went to the hospital. And over there was this family who was from sort of like northwest Pakistan. And they started speaking to us in Hindi, Urdu. Then we started talking to them, and they said that it was a mother and her two daughters had come, and she said that they had spent 3 years traveling into Switzerland. Can you imagine? Like crossing, like they were illegal immigrants. They were sort of like they on foot, you know, braving like harsh weather,
That
mountainous
too, yeah, and
territories.
it'll be cold, na, Tara? My
Yeah,
gosh.
and they
Yeah.
finally made it. And now they're here, and she joined her husband who's working here, and they obviously have a better life and all of those things. And she's like, I hate it here. I want to go back home. I
Oh
miss
gosh.
home. I said after all that for 3 years, but it just got me thinking, that there's just so
Mm-mm.
many untold stories and so many sort of
Yeah.
things that are yet to uncover. So I think we've really like covered a lot of interesting ways
Yes.
in which like writing is about sort of like research is sort of
Mm-mm.
so not
Like research
boring.
is the heart of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so
Yes.
not boring, right? I mean, what about you? Do you have any travel stories?
Yeah, actually, an incident came to mind, Tara, because speaking about like migrant families, a lot of people move for work, right? So recently, I'd gone to Goa, and it was the first time I wanted to try out paragliding. Okay, when I'm a little scared of water because I don't know swimming, so for me it was like a daredevil kind of thing. And the day we went for that, it was very high tide. Like I did not even know waters could get that rough. It was really rough. And I was mesmerized by the way the fishermen there were just, navigating it as if it's as if it's steady ground. Like as if the kind of confidence we have walking on ground, they are confident with water. And what was interesting was, obviously people speak Konkani in Goa, and I also know Konkani, but Kannada is actually our mother tongue because we are from Bangalore, and we found that the fishermen were from Karnataka, and immediately when they like struck a conversation with my dad, you could just see that they were looking for that connection, so what I wanted to do was, I just imagine following, shadowing, just like the scout that I mentioned earlier. I would love to shadow these fishermen, Tara, because I want to see what they can see. The way they look at a tide, the way they look at water, the way they look at fish or the wind or whatever. Like basically getting so confident with the sea, because it's a very, very different world. So yeah.
Wow, I would love to see some of that character in your book, Michelle.
Oh yeah, I
Uh,
hope so. One
yeah,
day.
like that's what I love about reading, right? We spoke about so much about writing and writers
Yes.
doing all this research, but that's the
Hmm.
thing I love about reading, because every book that you read is an entirely new world. It's a new
Yep.
geography. It's a new character. You know, I mean, like writers write fiction about sort of characters that are so different to them, right? Like we'd
Hmm.
interviewed Riya Mukherjee, who had sort of wrote a romantic story about three people in a relationship, right? That is so
Yes.
like out there, the amount of research that is required to even get into the brains of someone that's different from you,
Hmm.
talking to different characters. And then there was a book
Yes.
about army, girls in the army and the training that they go through.
Tanushree Poddar.
Anushri
Yes.
Podas. So lot
Yes.
like that's why I love reading, because just like how these authors themselves put themselves into different worlds in order
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
create, as a reader, we are also in that journey with the writers, because we are also participating in the world that these writers have created for us, and it's so different. And
Correct.
like if I could just take a camera and point it inside a reader's head,
Correct.
you'd see
Yes.
like it would be psychedelic. You'd see all kinds of
Yes.
like, images and visions and things. So
Ha.
it's so very different from that stereotype of, boring or,
Hmm.
or just sitting alone. It's so rich. That's what I think I really love about this world. What about you?
Yeah, that I would really love to get a peek into one of these readers' psychedelic minds. But I'm really curious about readers who go to lengths to find the book that they're looking for. Like certain stories that really interest in them. Have you heard of any stories, Sarah? I mean, since we have covered so much about writers, now that you spoke about readers, I'm really curious to see to what lengths readers can go to get a story.
Well, one of our listeners, shout out to her, listens to us from an oil rig. I know that she's reached out to us.
Yes.
And, readers do crazy things too. I think, standing in line, we've all done that. Standing in those long, long lines at 6 in the morning for Harry Potter books. That's definitely something. But I really want to know from our listeners and readers, what are some of the most out there, hatke things that you have done, either for a story or to get a book that you really really love. What are some of your stories? I'd love to hear that.
Yes, and I really hope that all of the stories that we share today, including our own interest in research, I really hope that you will be inspired to get stories wherever you can, right? So probably you cannot travel as these writers. What you can do is you can maybe just step out in the backyard and get a story. So because one of the books that come to mind is Onam in an IT. So this writer actually just looked at the backyard of her own house, right, in Kerala, of her own hometown, and she found such interesting details. So that's something I think we can do anytime, right? Just step out of your house, look around, and note down five things. I think that's a good starting point.
That's a great starting point. Yeah, exactly. So let's
Yes.
all sort of do that. And yeah, to anyone who is hesitating, let's bust the myth that
Yes.
writing and research is boring, because this is a
Yeah.
whole new colorful amazing world.
Yes, and if you do find some very good observations, please DM us. We would love to read your ideas.
Yep, we are at Bound India on all our social media platforms, and we're looking forward to this season. This season is going to be a very different season than the previous seasons. A lot more meteor conversations, different authors, different Tara and Michelle episodes. So we can't wait to go on this journey with you. So let's dive in. So here we are. We're at the end of yet another journey into the many worlds of books and beyond with Bound. I'm Tara Khandelwal.
I'm Michelle DeCosta, and this podcast is created by Bound, a company that helps you grow through stories. Find us at Bound India on all social media platforms.
So tune in every Wednesday if you live, eat, and breathe books. And join us as we discover more revolutionary books and peek into the lives and minds of some truly brilliant authors from India and South Asia.
And don't forget to keep your love for stories alive for books and beyond.